I think this is our last talk at 12 for the semester. Okay. So, a doubly special event. I'm really honored to introduce two of our long-term colleagues who will have to stand up so you can actually see them. Emily and Catherine are PhD candidates in human development, and they are really powerful members of the Bronfenbrenner Center community. You've been in this building working with us on multiple projects for, is it like 4 years? Both of you. Yeah, right? Yeah. Emily is on the verge of defending her dissertation. She is off to a job at RAND in Washington, D.C., starting in August. So we're sad to lose her presence in the building. Catherine is going to stay with us yet another year, which is a real gift. Today they're going to be talking with us about a multi-method research process that they used in a team context to develop an applied research agenda for palliative care. I think a good number of us in this room participated in one element of that, which was a research to practice consensus conference. Yeah, folks who were at the conference, would you? Yeah, okay, so we've got, at least 5 people in this room who participated in this. One thing that you'll see in their talk is that it's about findings, yes. It's also about a process that I think will generalize to a number of our different projects where we are working actively, for example, to develop research agendas in collaboration with very diverse partners. So, welcome, Emily. Welcome, Catherine. Thank you so much for giving this talk.
Thanks, John. So to start, I think just to keep us all on the same page about what is palliative care, to start out with a common definition. Palliative care focuses on symptom relief to improve quality of life for patients with serious illness. And it looks different in different places because there's some flux around the term, but the hallmarks of it are that it's delivered by interdisciplinary staff, so medical staff, but also social workers, chaplains, physical therapists, alternative practitioners. And it's usually in addition to other treatments people are receiving. So you might have your oncologist or cardiologist, but you also have a palliative care team that's treating you. And a question we get a lot is, like hospice, right? Like for people at the end of life, like, serious illness. And it's not. The way we think about it, and again, how people use the term varies a little bit, but that palliative care is an umbrella term for symptom-focused supplemental treatment that someone gets alongside curative treatment. And it also includes hospice care, which mostly happens, by definition at the end of life and mostly in the absence of curative treatment. So when I talk about palliative care, it's that whole umbrella of things that happen. So what we notice is that, there is this growing interest in palliative care. And I think the real underlying reason for that is that we're a rapidly growing older society. When you look at older adults, people over age 65, about 80% of them have at least one chronic condition, and about half of them have at least 2 chronic conditions, and many have more than that. And there's a lot of, symptom burden associated with having chronic illness. The way we die has also changed in the last 50 years. I think for, maybe it used to be a relatively short period of serious illness that resulted in death at the end of that time. But now people are dealing with heart disease, renal failure, lung disease, cancer, diabetes, other chronic conditions for many, many years, and that will ultimately result in death, but it could be much longer time than it used to be. There's also research lately, that says a lot of people, and this is more in the, in the 90s, a lot of people are in pain, just people walking around every day, and a lot of older adults, people in general, and have other burdensome symptoms that standard care isn't necessarily focusing on. So even though your oncologist might be focusing on your cancer, perhaps there's side effects of your treatment or just other things that are going on that aren't the focus of that practitioner's, it's not exactly what they're there for, so maybe those go undertreated. Pain is something I think that we might expect primary care physicians or cardiologists or oncologists to really help with, but there's other prevalent symptoms like anxiety, fatigue, depression, that I think lend themselves to a more psychosocial approach where you might want to involve therapists or other people to kind of treat these symptoms. As you can see here, the prevalence of these things, depression, anxiety, fatigue, really high across kind of conditions. And this is a meta-analysis, it's a meta-analysis showing the different ranges reported in different studies. So from our perspective as researchers, on the one hand, these are just some examples. There's a growing body of really high-quality evidence for the effectiveness of palliative care to improve patient and family outcomes. Some evidence that it saves money by giving people options that really help their quality of life that don't involve aggressive therapies. But that's, it's still part of the medical research. So that's where a lot of this stuff is happening. But on the other hand, there's been a steady increase in the number of hospitals that have palliative care services, and there's growing demand for this among a patient base. So there's this kind of two bipolar distribution of interest in this, on the practice side on the one hand and on the research side on the other. So we wanted to kind of put on our translational research hats and ask the question, and this is a question, it's an area we found a real gap in the research, to what extent are researchers and practitioners' priorities for research aligned? So are people, would the people on the ground want to ask the same questions or get the same information as the people writing the journal articles? Palliative care is really, the academic research side of it, it's a fairly diffuse field. So you have physician researchers, people in nursing, people in social work, other social scientists, all doing research on the same topic. I think many of them are working in silos, so they're addressing the things that are pertinent to their field, but they're not necessarily looking across fields. And the topic's really wide. It's a broad, focusing on patient quality of life is a really broad goal. So there have been several consensus conferences to create research agendas, over the last 15, 20 years. Right here. What we noticed was lacking in all of them, though, was a really systematic way to collect and incorporate practitioner perspectives. So sometimes practitioners were brought into these, sometimes they weren't, but it wasn't clear what the practitioner voice was, in contrast to the researcher voice in one of these. So with this project, our goal was to generate a research agenda, or an agenda for applied research, we're talking about it here, for palliative care, both based on the perspectives of academic research, but also really infusing it with practitioner priorities. And as a byproduct, something else we wanted to do with this project was to try to tweak some existing methods to create a really kind of interesting way of finding this, kind of answering the question that we think might be applicable in other cases. So we did three things. So the Thought Leader Survey happened about a year and a half ago, I guess now, and it was a telephone survey of leading palliative care academic researchers to ask their opinion on knowledge gaps. And it was just a friendly conversation, about 20 minutes, and then we kind of coded what they said with qualitative methods. We did a review of reviews, which was a review of the literature. We went through reviews of palliative care-related topics and said, what do people say more research needs to be done on? And then the final activity was a research practice consensus conference, where we kind of summarized what we had learned so far, presented that to researchers, and then asked them to comment on it and expand it and feed back to us and say, what's missing here, or what practice priorities do you have? Using the three separate research methods created a couple of opportunities for us. First, the ability to identify common research priorities that were shared between practitioners and researchers. And I think there's an option there or an opportunity to really raise the status of those priorities and to say that these are important for everyone. The second is to identify research priorities that are unique, I think, to frontline practitioners. And there's a question there. If everybody on the ground says we don't know enough about X, but no one in the ivory tower is asking that question, is it really because the question's unanswered, or is it a failure of translation? Do we need to get maybe the answers to frontline people better? And the third is, the project allowed us to test an alternative method for obtaining and pooling research recommendations. And we hope a method that would be useful to other fields that are characterized by this combination of rapid practice growth and research growth at the same time. So for each of the three research activities, we're going to describe the method and give a quick preview of the results. And we don't have time to go really into all the results from all the projects, but we'll do our best. We'll discuss then the overall pattern of results, so what research priorities were unique to practitioners, things that we were hearing from one group that we weren't seeing somewhere else, and conclude by kind of critiquing a little bit this whole project and the method and say, where do we think this really adds value and where does it not? So the Thought Leader Survey It's designed to go directly to academic researchers and in their own voice, ask them what they thought the knowledge gaps and barriers to doing better research in palliative care were. Sure, these people are writing journal articles, but there's this lag from what they might tell you on the phone to how long it would take to get published for a couple of years. So there's some currency by talking to people as they are now. And there's also, I think they have valuable opinions that might not come through in the research they do, just from their experience in the field. We used qualitative methods. We had the qualitative methods say it's okay to kind of pick your people purposefully. So we picked, I think about 70 people based on registered lists of leading researchers, people who've gotten grants recently in palliative care. We subjected them to a semi-structured telephone interview, again, 15, 20 minutes. We did a couple email interviews if people wanted them, and asked two questions mainly. One, what knowledge gaps do you see? Do you have any research recommendations? And the second question was about barriers. So it's, what are barriers in the field to expanded and improved research? We then transcribed all the interviews and used the crystallization immersion method to go through and determine themes. What were people saying? What was in common across the interviews? So of the 77 people we contacted, 61 completed interviews. About half of the respondents were MDs. A quarter were either nurses or sitting in schools of nursing. And the rest were kind of social scientists across disciplines. And we came up with 9 major themes, research recommendations. And I don't talk about the barriers here. We can touch on it a little bit later. But these were the, what do you think research needs to be done on? And they come up with ideas. And they fell into these 3 categories. One was how we do research right now as a field, how we deliver care as practitioners, and then who we serve. So the first 2 really focused on how we do research. They wanted more non-randomized controlled trial study designs. I was going to try to read these to you. They said, we need to come up with ways, these are quotes from the phone call, we need to come up with ways to do scientific projects that are not necessarily randomized controlled trials. I think it's really hard to do randomized controlled trials, and it might not be the most efficient way to collect data. Another person said, we need to think outside of the randomized controlled trial box by saying, I think mixed methods have to stay pretty high on the agenda because I'm a little worried that we impose our preconceived models in the areas. Unless we do some pretty sound qualitative work along with quantitative, we may be missing the boat. So they were speaking, frankly, about what they thought, the research methods should be in palliative care. And I'm sorry, I had a Mac to PC thing, so the animation's a little off. The second set of priorities, that second block there, is, there we go. It's the how we do. They also talked about outcomes and how we have to have better outcomes, psychometrically sound outcomes, but also ones that really speak to policymakers and speak to the reality of patients who are receiving palliative care. So many of the outcomes and factors that you're looking at in palliative research are subjective. It's not like you can get a blood test for pain. This person went on to encourage that more subpopulation-specific research be done to know that a pain scale has been validated in Hispanic populations, or this one in Asian American populations. And then here's this focus on policy relevance. We must address the needs of different stakeholders, including policy stakeholders. What do they need to know from the research in order to change the rules of the game for palliative care? So we had researchers kind of telling us things about where they thought the field should go, but it's not necessarily, I think, reflected in the work. The second set is about how we deliver care. They were interested in strengthening the evidence for symptom management. Someone complained that, the things we're teaching people in palliative care training programs right now, there's not a great evidence base for it. A lot of these are unproven, but yet we teach them as best practices. Health systems research, I think these folks all were kind of connected to health systems in some way, even as researchers. They knew it was complicated, that there's lots of pieces we had to look at how systems connect to each other. The effectiveness of cost effectiveness came up a lot, and almost everyone mentioned death panels when we were talking about them. So that's very much part of their world. Someone said very eloquently, I believe this is cost effective, but we can't lead with cost. You have to lead with better patient outcomes and, better quality of life. He's like, and if we get cost savings based on that, great. That can follow, but it has to lead with patient quality. They also critique practitioner knowledge and education. And the third one was about who we serve. There was a lot of concern about underserved populations, underrepresented populations, also communication between physicians and patients often, and caregivers, a lot of concern for caregivers. Not only caring for caregivers through things like psychosocial interventions, but someone spoke really eloquently about technical support. They said that often families are at home running feeding tubes or worrying about IVs, and they didn't know that that's what they were signing up for with home hospice. So, what do these people need just practically, and how can we get it to them? Okay. And then Catherine's going to talk about the next two segments of the project.
So our second project was really abstracting research recommendations from various review articles. So the primary objective of this portion of the project was to identify gaps and areas that we didn't know too much about through a review of the existing literature. So instead of taking a standard approach like a meta-analysis or a systematic review, which seeks to synthesize sort of what is known in the literature, we were trying to uncover what's not known in palliative care by treating the literature as narratives and abstracting various recommendations within each. So overall, we sought reviews for two specific reasons. The first was reviewing all of the publications within our time period was just deemed impractical. And second, because key individual themes are typically summarized within these review articles themselves. So in the following slides, I'll describe our methodological approach. So 7 major databases were searched for review articles or consensus articles on the topics of palliative as well as hospice and end-of-life care that were published between our time frame of 2005 to 2012, because as Emily sort of mentioned in the introduction, updates from 2004 and 2005 had already covered previous areas. Now, our flowchart here depicts our overall search strategy. So as we can see, 926 articles were found using this broad search. However, using electronic and hand searches, we then found that there were a number of duplicates, as we can see here, about 350. And then others were excluded for various reasons. Either they were not a review or consensus document. They were either chart, case, or record reviews. They had a focus on pediatric populations. We're looking more at the gerontological literature, or for other reasons. They're in a different language. They're based in a different country. So overall, we had 191 reviews, which were maintained for our data abstraction. However, only 41 of these did not contain any research recommendations as identified by the research team. So overall, we had about 150 of this grand total of 926 that we could actually use for data abstraction. Now, how did we do this? So this slide just kind of gives you a brief kind of snapshot of exactly what we did to abstract the various recommendations. So what we did is we went through each of the review articles and highlighted text that the reviewers decided would be a recommendation, such as research on shared decision-making, that's what SDM stands for, with palliative care populations should explore different types of decisions. So something such as this would then be coded into shared decision-making or sort of a similar content theme. Sometimes these recommendations were not so easy to identify, and that's a whole different piece of the process, which I don't have too much time to go into here, but I'm happy to explore that with other people if they're curious about this innovative method. Then, following the immersion crystallization framework for qualitative data, we then placed these different codes into these recommendations were then placed into themes or categories based on their sort of respective content. And then the list of categories were then refined, with new categories being added and some being deleted and so forth. What did we come up with? Well, 2 broad themes emerged. Overall, there was the area of methodology, or improvements in sort of methodological approaches, as well as specific topic areas. Now, within the area of methods, in contrast with what we found in the thought leader survey, researchers noted deficiencies in study designs, such as lack of control groups or representative samples, and they, on the other hand, were really advocating for randomized control trials and sort of rigorous research methods using those types of methodologies, as well as high-powered or comparative effectiveness studies, things of that nature. They also called attention to the pressing need for standardized and validated assessment instruments across a wide variety of domains, which could be applied in diverse clinical or research settings. They also asserted that we should really explicitly define our study aims and outcomes as well. There was also a call for a need of mixed methods or triangulation of various methods using qualitative and quantitative approaches. You guys have on your tables handouts which sort of identify all of these themes. However, I only chose the top half for both methods and and topic areas, so that's why there's only 4 here and then 6 with regard to our specific topic areas. So within the broad theme of topics, we can see that there's quite a good deal of emphasis not only on the individual factors of the patient, needs of caregivers, needs of professional and formal caregivers as well, but also on the interactions between among all of these multiple stakeholders. For example, the heightened emphasis on communication or joint decision-making was something that was noted of great importance within this review. So it's not just the cultural factors and these contextual factors as well as personal factors, but how do they really interact in a much more dynamic situation. I guess I missed that, but hopefully you guys caught on research methods, specific topic areas. So next, I'm going to describe our CITRA Research to Practice Consensus Conference, and hopefully some of you guys will fill in the details with some of this if we have a chance for discussion later on. So in this portion of the project, it was a little bit different from our first 2, the review of reviews and thought leader survey, because those were trying to pin down what academic researchers believed were the priorities for the field of palliative care. But recall that the goal of this project was really to merge the research recommendations from academics with frontline clinicians and people who are on the ground in the field. So to that end, we conducted 2 consensus workshops, one here in Ithaca, which a number of you have participated in, as well as one in New York City. So this model was used, which was based on the CITRA, the Cornell Institute for Translational Research on Aging, CITRA model, which was developed to really engage community partners, or engage both community partners and researchers in a very complex and highly intellectual dialogue. So let's see. The goals of our consensus conference, we had 3. First, the conference was designed to bring, as I mentioned before, both researchers and practitioners together in an equal status setting where they could engage in this high-quality dialogue about a specific topic area, in this case, palliative care. Second, we really wanted to solicit practice wisdom and guidance from people who are frontline clinicians on the ground with palliative care patients. And then the third goal, which isn't necessarily central to our research objectives, but it's a very important byproduct, and that's to engage and stimulate practitioner interest in research in order to promote the uptake of research as well as research translation. Now, there were 5 steps involved in this consensus workshop. So the first was to produce a non-technical report that summarizes the research findings which we found in the review of reviews as well as in the thought leader survey. Our non-technical report, presented the top research recommendations and then were distributed to conference attendees via email ahead of time. Next, we selected discussants who had expertise in the field of palliative care to give a brief reaction to the background document, just to kind of generate some dialogue ahead of time. Let's see. And then the third was actually to convene the meetings. We held consensus conferences, as I mentioned, at 2 sites, so one in Ithaca, New York, and then the other one in New York City. The conference themselves lasted for about 2.5 hours. So the first hours were kind of the welcome, the view from the discussants, their reactions to the background paper. And then we broke up into intentionally mixed small groups where we had members from chaplaincy, from nursing, from who are physicians, social work, all different kinds of disciplines, who are in these little mixed groups all around the room. They were then charged with the task of generating their own research recommendations, which note takers were then took down, each of the recommendations that were generated within the small groups. Then the participants, we all hung our various flip charts around the room, and participants went around with little stickers and sort of voted on what they believed to be the top recommendations, or what they felt were to be the highest priority for the field of palliative care. Now, after these initial meetings, we then summarized the preliminary results and sent them back to the participants, who then further refined the documents and the various recommendations that we had. We then had these follow-up roundtables about a month later at each site. And then the last step in the process was the dissemination of results. So recall that one of the project aims was to promote practice wisdom, and this was done so through the dissemination of findings, which is integral to achieving this goal. Our consensus workshops were very productive. Overall, there were 83 attendees from medicine, nursing, social work, academic research, chaplaincy, et cetera. There were 15 recommendations which were generated from Ithaca, and then another 24 from New York City, which came down to about 20 research recommendations, which then we boiled down, as you can see on your sheet, to about 10. Now, as we can see here, again, this is in contrast with the review of the reviews as well as the thought leader survey. A top recommendation for the practitioners and people in the field was really to increase public awareness and understanding of palliative as well as end-of-life care, not only for the public, as I said, but also within the medical community too, and how there's sort of a resistance toward death and dying. A second recommendation was to conduct research outside of the hospital setting, in homes, in other locations. Practitioners were also concerned with financial costs and the benefits of palliative care, as well as disseminating best practices both within and across care transitions, et cetera. So now we're going to further compare the research priorities across these methods, and I'll hand it over to Emily, who will describe it.
So I love this one because it kind of shows you where we are now in the project, which is we have to sum up that, like what is the same and what is different across all of these things. And this is the, the PowerPoint shorthand, little cryptic phrases, what are people really saying? So we can't, and we're really challenged actually by going through a comprehensive comparison of what, one group says to another, but we're going to try to just highlight a few strong themes that came out that we think might be just worth highlighting, I guess. When we talked to people at the Research Practice Systems Conference and then the thought leaders on the phone, we saw this constant raising this issue of death awareness and death avoidance in American culture that we didn't see in the published literature. None of their reviews on pain management said, by the way, we don't like to talk about pain because it means that we're suffering. Like no one said that, but we were getting this when we talked to people, so I think it kind of highlights the value. One of the thought leaders said, and I'll read the quote, the question was, what are the barriers to doing better research in palliative care? And she responded, America's whole cultural denial of death is a problem for palliative care. We have to get AA or RFP behind this, and what they are behind is 50-year-olds who want to live. The American Cancer Society is now happily on board with palliative care, so if they're on board, all hope's not lost. But I think it's American culture's idea that death is a failure. I think it's a real problem. People talked about this in practitioner culture, too. People go into medicine because they want to heal. And so what does that mean if all of a sudden we're saying that, maybe our focus isn't curative therapy? The primary focus isn't curative therapy within palliative care. Our practitioner said this too. That's kind of the most endorsed topic across sites, the New York City site and the Ithaca site, was to investigate awareness and understanding of palliative care by the public and by the medical community, with the goal of increasing awareness and consensus around these terms, hospice, palliative care, and end-of-life issues, but also the terms and the issues together. So that, they were talking about bus ads, like educating people. People don't actually know what happens to the dying body? How can we teach them about these things before they run into it? Not a surprise, but when we compared the three list of results, practitioners focused on practice. There was much more specificity in the things they wanted to know, and also on, okay, so how do we do this in primary care? How do we do this in the nursing home? How do we do this when people move from the hospital to the nursing home? There was this a granularity, I think, that kind of reflected their understanding of how people actually move through the system and where practitioners might be seeing people get lost. You know, somebody goes home and do we lose them because they've been discharged from the hospital back to their home? So I would call this, we were kind of figuring out what do you call it, this focus, and I think it's a systems perspective that people in the system kind of know the system and they acknowledge the interconnectedness of healthcare settings, but also the interconnectedness between care providers, informal caregivers, and families. The focus wasn't actually, in a lot of the recommendations, it wasn't on the people in the hospital bed, it was on everything that was going on around them and how can we deliver care to them best. The other thing that really struck me in the research practice conference, the review of reviews, the thought leaders talked about identifying best practices. How do you do a study so that you know which thing works the best, which treatment works the best? But practitioners were really explicit that you have to identify, test, and disseminate. And that came up a couple of times, that it's really not about just finding the answers, but how do you push it out to the people on the ground? So as far as, where should the field of palliative care be doing more research, practitioners were really the ones who said, we need to understand how to do dissemination. This is you. Oh, yeah. Look, already.
So in contrast, the researchers really wanted to focus on the specifics. They wanted to focus, they emphasized disease-specific symptoms as well as treatments for these various symptoms. So as we can see here, these are abstracted quotations from the review articles. One said, identifying common symptoms in advanced neurological disease could allow for evidence for management of these symptoms to be explored and expanded. Another quotation, identifying how best to provide a palliative approach to people with end-stage COPD within the context of active treatment is an important priority given the increasing prevalence of this disease globally. So there were a number of diseases that were mentioned, but very specifically, advanced neurological disease, chronic cough, heart failure, HIV, dyspnea, oncology, all of these the researchers felt were, warranted high research priorities, although they were very specific with regard to their approaches. They even mentioned specific treatments, such as nutrition and hydration, the management of ICDs, palliative chemotherapy, antidepressants, antiemetics. They were very specific, which is in contrast with what we found, with this broad systems approach, which Emily discussed with regard to practitioners who are saying, let's take a systems perspective and look at this as more of a holistic view. Next, the thought leaders were really quite concerned about funding. When we actually got people on the phone, in contrast with, these are people who are writing academic research articles, and so that's what they're saying when they're writing them down for publication. But what do they say when they're actually called up on the phone? Well, a unanimous concern was about funding. And that's something that wasn't actually seen within the review of reviews. So, for example, one person said, my colleagues are just frustrated. They don't know where else to turn because they're doing their best on these applications and they can't do the work. Another said, when a palliative care grant is being reviewed with a hypertension grant and a chemotherapy grant, it's really hard to stack up because of the immaturity of the science. The science in those areas is so much more mature. So they were really discussing how, there's the NIH, there's like a cancer foundation. It's really hard to find research on palliative care. It's much more about symptom management. So they were having difficulty with funding. Yeah.
It really worked this one out. So that, that's our kind of rough sense of how these things compare to each other. But what about the method? Does this method work for us that we planned out about 2 years ago and then went through and did these three things? Did it, get us what we thought we'd get out of it? So they all come with limitations. And I think it's worth noting, when you kind of reflect back on what we did for each activity, all of the methods seem fairly standard. It's a telephone survey, it's literature review, consensus conference. These things have all been done before. But we did something a little different in each one. So with the telephone survey, we asked people about barriers and as well as recommendations. With the literature review, we actually kind of zoom down to the part at the end where people make recommendations and see what they said there, rather than looking at, their headline findings. And the research practice consensus conference, the consensus conference is a common thing in science and medicine, but the idea of pulling practitioners into that is fairly innovative. But each has limitations. The thought leader survey, really sensitive to our sample, and it was really hard to determine, how people would rank priorities. So that, a couple of people said this thing was the highest priority for them. They might have said that explicitly in the quotes, but then someone else raises another issue. So that's, assigning weight to a purposive sample of qualitative methods is difficult. In the review of reviews, and Catherine mentioned the kind of things these people said. It was really specific. It's like, I have done a review on chronic cough, and I think more research should be done on chronic cough. It's like, big surprise. I think we all do that. We're all guilty of that at the end of our article to say, I want more research to be done on the thing that I want to do research on. But there aren't really good standards for reporting research gaps. And if the purpose of a systematic review, like the kind that we were pulling out, is to go through and talk about what is known, there might be some worth in standardizing that little last part to say, okay, now, authors, tell us what's not known. Tell us what's missing here. And so we suffered a little bit because there wasn't that standard. So I think people were sometimes not even saying anything needs to be done, sometimes being very specific and helpful for us, for our purposes. And the recommendations were difficult to interpret. You might have examples of that. Sometimes it was just too vague.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, no.
See if you can think of one.
Yeah, I'll think of one for later for the question.
But we struggled a lot with that abstracting to say, like, what are they even saying here? That more research, what's missing? So that was the limitation. And the Research Practice Consensus Conference, I think, got us really great results. It was a group-based process, so the downside is always that maybe you had a person who was dominating each small group discussion, although, as a note taker in one of the groups, I didn't see that happening for my group. It was also based on a background document that we gave people to kind of prime their thinking, so maybe that influenced discussion in ways that we didn't intend, to steer the conversation, but perhaps other things would have come up had we not given them that piece of background. Aggregating recommendations always is always challenging. We had so many people saying so many great things over hours and hours, and so then we have to boil it down to a list of 10 or 15 things to try to feed back to the academic research world. And I think we're sensitive to losing detail that really could have been, might have been more useful had we had a different format to report back in. And it's time intensive. It took, and not just our time, but it was time of our participants, and I think that's how much of someone's time can you take up in a 2-hour workshop and then a 1-hour follow-up workshop with these documents in between. We had a lot of generosity on the part of our participants, but we also understand that they're busy people, and they are practitioners. They're out there, like, doing the work, so we don't want to keep them from that too much, even for their great opinions. I think to conclude about the method, the pattern of results we saw was that the triangulation through the 3 methods offered a lot of compatible insights, and that, I think, is good news for the field of palliative care. It's okay, I think, to say that we found similar ideas across constituent groups. So maybe, practitioners aren't really that misaligned with what researchers want. The method has, I think, its challenges, it's time-consuming, but it did highlight a couple of things that were coming out on the ground that weren't coming out in academic research, and we do think that other fields could kind of avail themselves of these methods, either, individually or as a whole, especially in fields where, there's a lot of practice going on, a lot of research going on, and the question about the connection between those is outstanding. So finally, I'll thank our funders, the Lawrence and Rebecca Stern Family Foundation and the Roy Ball Center at Cornell. Thanks. We have lots of time for discussion or comments or. Okay, sure, Charlie.
I'm interested in your decision process around providing some written material for people before the consensus.
Mm-hmm. The CITRA research practice model was formulated, it's been used several times in other projects, falls prevention, psychosocial isolation was another one of them, volunteerism, I think. And the idea was that if you really want to engage either practitioners or just people, just non-academic researchers, you need to give them enough so that they feel like they're on equal footing around the topic. And the model comes out of actually a Danish model for public issues education, where you have scientists and citizens trying to come to terms over, like, you know, should we put new turbines in the bay or something like that. So there's the sense of, like, can you create something that's in non-technical language, that's an honest kind of survey of where the state of the field, to give to people who aren't necessarily, like, living in the medical journals all day, to keep them on the same page. So does that answer your question?
No, it does.
Okay.
We're doing the same thing in another study. I'll follow up with you after, maybe, but it's a double-edged sword, because then you frame in some ways the way they're going to approach the questions. So that's great because you get the focus, but it might also crowd out other things that might be priorities for them.
Sure.
I guess maybe that's handled through facilitation.
Well, you know, so our background document had 14 things in it, including methods and measures, you know, a couple items of methods and measures. And we kept a flip chart with the 14 recommendations up at the front of the room, and we said, if you would like those, you may vote on those as well with your stickers. And a lot of people did come back with methods and measures, and that was one in particular that I wonder would people have just thought of on their own. And these folks might have, but they also came up with a lot of other ideas. So I don't think it hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah, my impression sitting through that is that people were not at all constrained by the report. I mean, they quickly went beyond.
Yeah.
Because the instruction wasn't saying, oh, you're a small group. Okay, let's look at the report and what the report said, and let's talk about that. I mean, the instructions were, let's talk about the issues and what your point of view is. You can draw from that, maybe, but it wasn't any. People seem very free to go way beyond what the report had said.
Yeah, I can say as a participant, it was helpful to get the information ahead of time and review, because I don't read a lot of research, and so, but I have a lot of opinions about what I think should be researched. So it was helpful to have that ahead of time, and it didn't sway me.
On one of your slides, the later slides, you talked about how this process set the agenda for some pilot grants.
Oh, did I
And
miss that?
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned just, you know, the dissemination process and the importance of dissemination. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about pilot grants and dissemination.
Yeah, so I mean, we're in a translational research center. We went out and we talked to people on the ground, and we have this list, and then the question is, like, well, what do you do with that to, like, get it back the other direction? So we're working on, you know, journal articles, and that speaks to one audience that might be academic research in palliative care who might look at this and say, oh, I never thought about it, you know, and take something from that. But the funding from the Stern Foundation was also, we had a few pilot grants to give out, so we did a call for, I think there were mostly people new to palliative care research who could, I'm not sure if we provided them with a list of priorities or if that was just part of the internal process for choosing things, but to try to get researchers started down the path on some of these topics that practitioners said were important. So we did do, I think, 6 pilot grants.
One of them, too.
Right.
On decision-making.
Yeah, and decision-making about...
Actually, mine is in the context of joint replacement, so how people go about making decisions around sort of like acute, you know, instances and sort of a longer-term chronic illness. So it's not so much about the end of life. Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time.